Well, welcome to our series on 1 Corinthians. We're on 1 Corinthians chapter 6 now, which, let's face it, it's a tricky one. Well, it's only a tricky one if you come from a particular point of view. We're doing this one. You can see the year we're doing it. Well, we're not doing it in 2020, but it's just after the Jubilee weekend. So this was a really weird kind of talk for that time of year. But as we're plodding our way through the book, we thought, well, we go with it as the cards fall. So we're going to start by reading 1 Corinthians chapter 6. And I'm going to read it from the Message translation. And the reasons for that will come about later. Partly, I like the Message because it makes us read scripture differently, because it's not the way that we've been brought up, for those of us that have been brought up with this sort of stuff. It's not the way that we've traditionally read it. So the Message makes you think differently. It's very good for that. And also because the Message tries to put it in contemporary language, which surprisingly, some of the other translations don't. So let's take a look at 1 Corinthians chapter 6. How dare you? Should I do that again? How dare you take each other to court? When you think you've been wronged, does it make any sense to go before a court that knows nothing of God's ways instead of a family of Christians? The day's coming when the world's going to stand before a jury made up of Christians. If someday you're going to rule the world's fate, wouldn't it be a good idea to practice on some of these smaller cases? Why, we're even going to judge the angels. So why not these everyday affairs? As these disagreements and wrongs surface, why would you ever entrust them to the judgment of people you don't trust in any other way? I say this as bluntly as I can to wake you up to the stupidity of what you're doing. Is it possible that there isn't one level-headed person among you who can make fair decisions when disagreements and disputes come up? I don't believe it. And here you are taking each other to court before people who don't even believe in God. How can they render justice if they don't believe in the God of justice? These court cases are an ugly blot on your community. Wouldn't it be far better to just take it, to let yourselves be wronged and forget it? All you're doing is providing fuel for more wrong, more injustice, bringing more hurt to the people of your own spiritual family. Don't you realise that this is not the way to live? Unjust people who don't care about God won't be joining in his kingdom. Those who use and abuse each other, use and abuse sex, use and abuse the earth and everything in it, don't qualify as citizens in God's kingdom. A number of you know from experience what I'm talking about, for not so long ago you were on that list. Since then you've been cleaned up and given a fresh start by Jesus, our Master, our Messiah, and by our God present in us, the Spirit. Just because something is technically legal doesn't mean that it's spiritually appropriate. If I went around doing whatever I thought I could get away with, I'd be a slave to my whims. You know the old saying, first you eat to live, and then you live to eat. Well, it may be true that the body is only a temporary thing, but that's no excuse for stuffing your body with food or indulging it with sex. Since the Master honours you with a body, honour him with your body. God honoured the Master's body by raising it from the grave. He'll treat yours with the same resurrection power. Until that time, remember that your bodies are created with the same dignity as the Master's body. You wouldn't take the Master's body off to a whorehouse, would you? I should hope not. There's more to sex than mere skin on skin. Sex is as much spiritual mystery as physical fact. As written in scriptures, the two become one. Since we want to become spiritually one with the Master, we mustn't pursue the kind of sex that avoids commitment and intimacy, leaving us more lonely than ever. The kind of sex that can never become one. There's a sense in which sexual sins are different from all others. In sexual sin, we violate the sacredness of our own bodies. These bodies that were made for God-given and God-modelled love, for becoming one with one another. Or didn't you realise that your body is a sacred place, the place of the Holy Spirit? Don't you see that you can't live however you please, squandering what God paid such a high price for? The physical part of you is not some piece of property belonging to the spiritual part of you. God owns the whole works. So let people see God in and through your body. That, is good stuff. I tell you, we picked a right one. I should have given this one to Dave. Now, Dave Ellis, our regional minister, the Reverend David Ellis, the regional minister, he talked about 1 Corinthians 5. And 1 Corinthians 5, as we've learnt, as we've started this series, if you look at the Bible Project on YouTube, they kind of show how the chapters in Corinthians do kind of pair. They pair up with each other. So what we're doing today, or on this talk, is kind of building on what talks about in 1 Corinthians 5. And 1 Corinthians 5, if you recall, people were having inappropriate sexual relationships. Sometimes even within their family, like with step-parents and stuff. And Paul was saying, this isn't right. This isn't how you should be living. So Paul starts to build on this. But it also, the chapter 5, as does this chapter, it's talking about church discipline. Now, that's often seen as a negative thing. But church discipline actually is about how do we live and order our lives. Everyone has a discipline. If you make a cake, you have a discipline of baking. It's just the word that we're using. So if you're driving a car, there is a discipline to drive in the car. Everything has a discipline if you have an order and a structure to it. And if you've got a group of people together, a bunch of humans, there are times when it's just chaos. If the extended family are around, it's just chaos. Everyone runs wild. That's fine. But you wouldn't live like that all the time. Normally within a family, you have a structure, and this is how we live and this is how we behave. And sometimes we let our hair down, but basically this is our default, where we kind of have an order, where we can support and nurture and love one another. And that's what Paul is talking about, particularly in chapter 5. So if someone is behaving in a way that isn't right and is hurting everyone else, you call them out, you sort them out. You don't worry about people you don't know down the street doing that. Paul's saying if they don't profess to believe in Jesus or be part of the church family, leave them alone. Let them crack on with it. What Paul's saying is, if you're within part of the church family, there are ways of living that reflect God. And that's important. You can't do what you want because you've got a new master now. So, it is interesting that Paul talks about within the church family, don't judge people outside the church. So quite where the church gets this thing from, where it's always going on about everyone else in the world and how they should or shouldn't be behaving, is anyone's guess. I don't know. Perhaps we just like pointing the finger over there in the hope that no one notices what's going on over here. I don't know. Draw your own conclusions from that. Now, in 1 Corinthians 6, which is the reading we just had from this book, Paul carries on this theme. Well, there's two themes, really, with this. The first theme is that our bodies are to be used for God's glory. So don't do anything immoral with it. Now this is a high view of physicality. This is a high view of our bodies. It's not a rejection of the physical. This is actually God saying, look, you're wonderfully made. You're a work of art. Look at you. You're amazing. Don't do anything that would ruin that. You're wonderfully made. You wouldn't use a tapestry to wash your car, would you? You wouldn't feed the cat out of a Ming vase, would you? You just wouldn't do it. So Paul's saying, look, the body that God's given you, it's a wonderful thing. Look after it. Treat it right. Your body is the same. It glorifies God. So don't be ashamed of it. Don't be embarrassed by it, and don't misuse it, because it's great. And secondly, we have this list of behaviours that Paul has seen going on in the Corinthian church. And note, if you will, the importance and the priority of the different things. Now, most of this section, this is the kind of middle part of the reading. I'll read it again in a different translation in a moment, and you can see how it reads. Now, most of the list that Paul gives is about Christians falling out with each other, taking each other to court. He's saying, what are you doing taking your sisters and brothers in the church to court? What are you thinking? Why don't you just suck it up, get over it, and it'll be all right? Instead, imagine that. Imagine like in our church family, if there's two, here we all are on a Sunday morning, sit together. Someone over there, right, is going to court with someone over there. What the dickens is going on? What's happening? Paul is saying, why would you do that? Sort it out, he says. Just as in the previous chapter, he says, if the thing's going wrong within the church family, sort it out. So he lists these things. And if you read 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 to 10, which I'm about to in a very few seconds, you'll see a list of things there: slander, drunkenness, adultery. And guess which one people pick up on? Let's have it then. 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Here we go. Now this, right, I will just say this before we start. This is what's known, and you may be aware of such things, as a clobber text. Now, clobber, this isn't in terms of clothes. A clobber text is a text that you will find in the Bible, usually a very short reading, and you take it, you disregard everything around it. You take it like a weapon, because and when you take it out of context, it agrees with what you think is right. And then you find someone who thinks differently, and then you take this text and you whack them with it. That, my friends, is a clobber text. Now, in the Bible, for this subject that we're about to discuss, there's 7 specific clobber texts that people use within a certain stream of the church to clobber pretty much everyone else in and outside the church. Even though Paul says don't judge people outside the church, let them sort themselves out. Anyway, so people use this text. So here we go. 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Surely you know the wicked won't possess God's kingdom. Don't fool yourselves. People who are immoral, or who worship idols, or who are adulterers, or homosexual perverts, or who steal, or are greedy, or are drunkards, or who slander others, or are thieves. None of these will possess the kingdom. Some of you are like that, but you've been purified from sin. You've been dedicated to God. You've been put right with God by the Lord Jesus and by the Spirit of our God. Now there's a list, eh? There's a list and a half. And which one in that list has the church mainly focused on? You've got it. So this clobber text is used to beat people who are gay. There's no other way of describing it. I don't see this text being used when people are slandering one another. Perhaps when we see people worshipping idols such as the internet or money or pop stars. I don't see it happening then. I don't see this being used about people who are stealing, perhaps from work or even in the streets. I don't see this being used when we see people who are greedy, who are getting, oh, I'll have another car now. Oh, I'll get a bigger house now. Oh, I'm going to can't come to church and be part of the church family anymore because I've got a job that involves more hours and more pay. I don't see the text being used in those contexts. The only time I ever have seen this text being used is to clobber gay people. So what do we do with it? Because when you read it on the surface, it says, and sorry kids if you're watching this, homosexual perverts. So we think Paul is saying people who are homosexuals are also perverts because we put those two words together. So what do we do? It appears that God is a sort of God who doesn't like this sort of thing. So let's not dodge this anymore. Let's have this out now. I want to state unequivocally and clearly, so there can be no doubt at all whatsoever that God does not hate gay people. I would even go further to say that God has no problem with gay people. No more problems actually that he's got with straight people on that front, actually. Now, I know this is a kind of a strange subject to preach on, isn't it? Because normally you just get, in effect, hate preaching on this subject. And also for us, the church and our setting, it kind of never comes up, does it? Which is why it's important, and this is why you should preach through a book, because you can't avoid these things that people hear about and then never discuss because it's too awkward. Let me explain to you how I've reached this conclusion from a scriptural point of view. Now, from a human and a cultural point of view, I've reached this conclusion, right, because I have eyes and I've looked around me and I've seen what's going on in the world, and actually it doesn't distress or bother me. I've seen the science behind gender and sexuality, and it doesn't distress or bother me. So I've had to look at the scripture from a scriptural point of view and say, well, actually, the church has been saying this for centuries. Is that right? Because that doesn't tally with the reality I see around me. A bit like when you read the dome of the sky in the Old Testament, which they've believed held the waters back, you could say, well, the Bible tells me that the earth is flat, there's a dome above it, and above that dome is lots of water, and God every now and then opens the windows and the rain falls in. That's what the Bible tells me. But I look at science and I think, well, actually, no, it's not like that, which means I have to go back to the Bible and say, well, scripturally, what does this mean? How do I understand that? And it's exactly the same on almost everything to do with scriptures. We have to look at the reality of the world we're in, the reality of God and God's truth, and where do they fit? So, here's my scriptural understanding of this reading. Now, I need to give you some background, because the New Testament was written in Greek. And my people yesterday reminded me when I was training, they called it New Testament Greek, but it's actually called Street Greek. So it's kind of a street Bible. Do you know what I'm saying? It's a street Bible. This Bible is. It's in Street Greek, which is more recent than ancient Greek, but it's nothing like the Greek that's spoken today. Well, it's like it, but not really. A bit like Old English would be to English. Anyways, yeah. Now, there is no direct translation for the word homosexual or gay, as we would understand it, into Street Greek from 2,000 years ago, because the understanding of homosexuality or being gay was completely different to the understanding of it is now. It's a bit like trying to explain an aeroplane. There will be no aeroplane. It's not that it's been invented, by the way, but the whole idea of the 21st century understanding of science and people is completely different to what it was then. Which means when someone's translating the Bible, what they have to do is say, what's the best words we can use? Which means instantly they are interpreting what a word means. And that changes, and it will vary from one New Testament Greek scholar to the next. You could have two of them sat in a room. One say, well, it means this. Another one says, well, actually, it means that. And often it's just nuances, but it's to do with interpreting what the word means. Now, the two words that Paul uses here, that the Good News Bible, I think, unhelpfully translates as homosexual perverts, are most likely to be the kind of two words that were used to refer to male prostitutes in the temples. Now, if you recall, and Paul refers to idols, one of the issues in the Corinthian church were people were still living their old pagan ways. And by pagan, I don't mean the contemporary neo-paganism that we have today in the 20th and 21st century. I mean like year zero, common era paganism. So there were temples around with prostitutes that people would use, and that would be an act of worship within the temple. I know, kind of sounds interesting. You think, well, the world could be a very different place. But anyway, that was what was going on. And one of the things Paul is saying is you can't behave like that anymore because your body isn't to be used for that anymore. Your body glorifies God, so use it right and enjoy it and make the most of it and don't destroy it. So Paul is saying basically, and this would be essentially to the men in the church there, don't go with male temple prostitutes. What are you thinking? Do you see? But when we see in the 21st century homosexual perverts, we think, oh, well, obviously Paul thought all homosexuals were perverts. And he didn't. He had no concept of homosexuality that we have today. I mean, I think even in my lifetime, the way that we've learned and our understanding of homosexuality has changed. And even if you're an extremely conservative evangelical Christian type that doesn't like this sort of thing, and I'm sure not all of them are like that, but some are, even your understanding of homosexuality will have changed in the last few decades because we've learnt more and things have changed. That doesn't mean you like it, but things have changed. Our understanding of the Bible has changed. We've learnt more. We've learnt how words have changed. We've learnt the meanings of words. Things like the Dead Sea Scrolls have advanced our understanding of the translating of the New Testament because we've learnt more. So don't go back to the King James Version. It might be very nice poetically, but from a scholarly, academic and accuracy point of view, sometimes the translation isn't quite right. It's not all there because it's been interpreted. So when you read that clobber text, it's not as straightforward as you perhaps think and as perhaps the church has taught us. So in summary, this particular clobber text, and I have said to our church generally, if we want to have a Bible study on this subject of sexuality and gender and all that, all those things that actually people are, well, as the world shifts, as our understanding grows, is what's God saying into all this? Because I don't believe God is saying, no, let's go back to the medieval period. I think God is saying, let's change now. We can have a Bible study on that, and I'm all for that. There's stuff to be found on the internet that can educate and grow. And this is an issue. You may think it doesn't affect me, but I suspect actually you do. Because I think if you look at who's arguing, it's often church leaders that are telling their congregation to be thinking in a certain way. And actually most people have gay friends, have people in their family who are gay. And actually you think, well, what the church is saying isn't right. That's not how I understand it. That's not how I see it happening. The church has not behaved well in the way it's treated people who are gay. It struggled to separate cultural issues from biblical ones. It has failed to interpret and seek to understand the Bible because it's overlaid its cultural assumptions onto the reading it's had. It hasn't even bothered to see what the words are behind the English that we have here. It hasn't bothered to look at the context that Paul was talking about. So for now, and for this reading, hold on to the fact, and it is a fact, that it's not as clear cut as the church has been telling us for all these years. And just as we've seen the Bible used to justify war, yes it has. It's been used to justify slavery, yes it has. It's been used to justify the oppression of women, yes it has. And we as disciples of Jesus in the 21st century, we need to make sure that we stand for what is right and what is Christ-like. So learn to read the Bible. Don't learn the Bible. Learn to read it, and to read it intelligently and compassionately. Now this talk was done during the Jubilee, and I'm going to finish it with the quote I finished with on that talk, because it's a good quote and it also marks the Jubilee. The Jubilee actually does fit this theme, or did fit this theme, because there's something here about commonwealth and nations working together, people working together not despite their differences, but because of their differences. They can bring all kinds of things to the table. And this is an image Paul develops later himself. He talks about the body, the church being a body of people. But we have a responsibility to one another, to look out for and to look after one another. And we also have a responsibility to ourselves to ensure that we are doing what we can as a disciple of Christ. So I'm just going to finish with a quote from Queen Elizabeth II, from a Christmas talk she did a few years back, where she talks about these things. She says, "For me, the life of Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, whose birth we celebrate, is an inspiration and an anchor in my life, a role model of reconciliation and forgiveness. He stretched out his hands in love, acceptance and healing. Christ's example has taught me to seek to respect and value all people of whatever faith or none." How would Jesus respond and behave? And how too can we? Amen. And God bless.